The Nightmare on Elm Street franchise has some massive ups and downs throughout the 9 movies in the series. But looking back on the movie that started it all, how does the original age now that it's 40 years old? Well, let's talk about it. Welcome to the channel, everybody. My name is Matt, and this is the beginning of my review of the entire A Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. And of course, we got to start with the all-time classic, the original A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. And today, specifically, I want to talk about why I still think this movie, even after 40 years, is still a masterclass on just a great story by Wes Craven, and then also translating that so well onto the screen. So let's just jump right into it. Of course, the original Nightmare on Elm Street was written and directed by Wes Craven. A lot of you know Wes from the Scream franchise, of course, but he was fresh off of Swamp Thing, The Hills Have Eyes, The Last House on the Left, some of the movies he had directed before this, and was kind of, struggling a little bit as a director, and essentially mortgaged this idea for A Nightmare on Elm Street and gave it to Bob Shaye, the founder of New Line Cinema, the owner of that company, and said, hey, I'll give you all the rights if you help me make this movie. And they did. And Bob also had to essentially mortgage pretty much everything as well, including his company, which is why they kind of say New Line is the house that Freddy built, right? A lot of you have probably heard that. But A Nightmare on Elm Street, it's such a relatable story in so many ways. I mean, just the concept of this movie comes from real life stories of these refugee men that Wes Craven had heard about who were dying in their sleep after these disturbing nightmares. So even just that concept of like the realism that maybe this could happen. This was stuff that was popping up in the news, and it was terrifying. I mean, it is terrifying, of course. It just makes the story and this concept so relatable, and also is just, a little piece of the greatness of this movie, which we'll discuss, of course, for a little bit here. Also, I mean, just this concept of Freddy Krueger and just the idea of, the creepy man in your town or your neighborhood is also something you could relate to, especially if you were a kid running around in the 80s or the 90s. It was kind of like, oh, that guy? Look at that guy. That guy's weird. That guy does this. That guy does weird stuff. Do you remember that one time that guy did this? Just that creepy man that kids can relate to, that like, you need to stay away from that person in your neighborhood. And that's just something there. And then, of course, in this movie, you've got the kids in high school, right? And it's a story that, especially if you grew up in the 80s and the 90s, you can relate to these stories, and these stories hit home for us, especially because they were such a big part of movies in the 80s and the 90s. But this concept of just kids figuring it out on their own, whether it's movies like The Goonies or this movie, it's just that concept of there's something going on. The parents don't believe you. The police don't believe you. So you're on your own. And there's just something about that, especially when you watch the original Nightmare on Elm Street as a kid. It's so cool and so relatable because, of course, as a kid, kind of your attitude is like, no, I can do it. I'm a big kid now. Especially if you're in high school, it's kind of like you want that independence. All you want is really just to grow up, which is funny because when you get old as hell, you just want to be a little bit younger. But of course, just that concept of we want to do this on our own. And watching that play out as these kids figure this out because nobody believes in them. It's just such a relatable and cool concept to think about, and is another reason why I think this movie was so successful. But it's just, like I said, it's one of those things. It's how you feel as a teenager. It's a coming of age tale in some ways. A Nightmare on Elm Street, of course, and something that encapsulates that and encapsulates just how you would feel if you were having these terrible nightmares, potentially your friends being killed in their nightmares, and you were in high school. Something that encapsulates that so well is the moment when Nancy falls asleep at the school. She has the nightmare at school. She wakes up. It seems like everything is normal. She's in class just like normal. But then she goes down the hallway. The hall monitor's like, hey, Nancy, no running in the hallways. Just that whole moment and everything that happens after that makes it also one of those things. I mean, hell, I fell asleep in high school all the time, but it's just even more relatable and makes this movie just even more effective for people of that age, or people who, of course, were that age at one point in time. It's just something you think about. And of course, there's so many iterations of Freddy in this franchise on how Freddy looks, right? Later on in the franchise, there was a lot less of the makeup and prosthetic work because Robert Englund just didn't want to have to sit in the chair, and also just didn't like how it felt on his face. So of course, this is early Freddy. This is when Freddy had the extensive makeup. It fit so well in his face. It looked like, realistic and like a real burn victim, juicy and moist. And Freddy just as a character, of course, like they didn't want to put Freddy in a mask because they knew Freddy needed to toy with his victims, which is so great in this movie and makes Nightmare on Elm Street so effective and sets it apart from so many of the other slashers, especially in the 80s, of course. I mean, after movies like Halloween and Friday the 13th, kind of every movie wanted to have that masked killer, where you could essentially put a stunt man behind the person and do fine. But of course, they needed that like highly trained actor in the end. After testing stuntman, they were like, well, we got to go with somebody who can, portray the charisma, toy with his victims, make people laugh, but also be scary at the same time.
Please, God.
This is God.
Robert Englund, I mean, incredible, obviously a legend. I don't need to talk too much about that. But, Freddy's charisma, a scene that always comes to mind in the original Nightmare on Elm Street for me that just encapsulates Freddy toying with his victims, having fun. It's like he could kill him at any time he wants, but that's not the point. He's a sick, sick man who wants to kind of play with his food. Of course, you've got the scene early on when you first see Freddy in the back alleys. That whole moment where he's like cutting off his fingers, his arms are stretching out. You've got that, of course. But the moment that I always think about that I love, that's just so great, is the moment when Nancy picks up the phone and you've got the whole phone tongue scene, and it's like, I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy. Love that moment.
Well,
I'm your boyfriend now, Nancy.
The phone was like a $5 prop. Wes Craven kind of laughs about that, but such a great moment, a funny moment. Horrifying, and it's just one of those moments I love when Freddy toys with his victims like this. And of course, I mean, you can't talk about Freddy in the original Nightmare, or just Freddy in general, without talking about Freddy's glove. I mean, it's such a great idea to use Freddy's glove in the way that they did. They toyed with other things, other weapons, of course, like any antagonist in a slasher movie would. But ultimately, they came up with this idea of Freddy's glove, which is brilliant. It's something that creepy man in the neighborhood or somebody you heard about on the news, it's this crude weapon that they would have made in a garage in some dirty, kind of dangerous neighborhood. And of course, the intro of the original Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy making the glove, is so great and kind of sets up the rest of the movie in, of course, so many ways. And it's such a great intro just in horror in general. The original Nightmare also does such an incredible job keeping Freddy mysterious and in the shadows. I don't mind Freddy like in A Nightmare 2, where he's kind of more out and about. You see a lot of him. But in this movie, it's such a good blend and such a good, just, I guess you could say, mixture of keeping Freddy in the shadows, but also showing him at crucial moments, keeping him scary and mysterious. Love that in the original Nightmare on Elm Street, of course. And this movie, of course, just keeps Freddy, just to talk more about mixture and blend, it just keeps Freddy scary and horrifying, but also trickling in just enough humor. Of course, later on in the franchise, the franchise takes a lot of flack for just leaning too much into one direction. For me personally, the humor side of it, for me personally, I prefer the Nightmare movies that obviously do have some wittiness and humor to them, but lean a little bit more towards the horror and the scary side of Freddy. I personally prefer that. A lot of people don't, though. but that's just kind of what I prefer. And I love how in the original, Freddy's very scary. One of the, of course, the scariest Freddys in the franchise. Definitely up there, top 2, top 3, which is great. And I mean, the original Nightmare, of course, would not be as great as it is, would not be as memorable as it is if it didn't have Heather Langenkamp in the movie, of course, playing Nancy Thompson. She is just such the perfect blend of somebody who's smart, resilient, the girl next door, someone who is very, comes across as very non-Hollywood, which was something that Wes Craven was looking for. They had auditioned like some 200 actresses to play Nancy's character, and Heather Langenkamp was what they were looking for and is the perfect choice. She's just somebody you truly look at and is like, I'm on her side. I don't know much about her. I don't know, what we're doing, but I'm on Heather's side and I want her to survive. I wish we could have gotten, Heather back in the franchise more than we did. Of course, I would have loved to have seen Nancy in part 2, but we'll talk about that later. But yeah, I mean, Nancy, A Nightmare on Elm Street, Freddy Krueger, that trio, you can't really talk about the original Nightmare without talking about Nancy and of course Freddy. But such a crucial part of this movie. The cast just in general from top to bottom is incredible in this movie. I mean, you go back and you look and you're like, oh, that person's in this, and it's just, like I said, from top to bottom is great. I mean, obviously Johnny Depp's first movie ever in Hollywood, playing Glen, Nancy's boyfriend in this movie. I mean, of course, he went on to do incredible things and became a huge star, but you could see it early on, playing Glen. He did a great job. His death scene, I mean, damn. But yeah, Johnny Depp, great in this movie. And of course, I mean, even just characters like Nancy's dad, Don, played by John Saxon, a legend in the genre. You probably recognize him from the original Black Christmas, somebody who had was the most well-known actor for sure in this cast when this movie was made. Huge history of just great work in the past. And it's just another example of how horror does such a great job in the genre of finding these actors who kind of maybe their career is kind of teetered off a little bit, but have so much talent, but for whatever reason, they're just maybe not really getting the roles that maybe they deserve. They've kind of fell off a little bit, maybe for personal reasons or whatever have you, but kind of bringing them back to the light and utilizing their skill set in such a great way. It kind of reminds me of the original Saw, how in the original Saw, you see Cary Elves in that movie, an actor who you recognize right away, but, wasn't really in stuff for a little while before Saw, and also Danny Glover in Saw. Kind of reminds me of that a little bit, but yeah, John Saxon, incredible in the movie. I mean, of course, Nightmare on Elm Street, you got to talk about the score by Charles Bernstein. One of the greatest horror scores ever, probably in movie history. Just one of those scores that's so subtle, but so effective, which of course is something that we always look for in a memorable, great score. It's just amazing. Makes the movie in a lot of ways, is probably like damn near 40% of the movie, 30-40% of the movie. You got to give your hats off to the score for creating the mood and the atmosphere and the creepiness. It's crazy to me that there's movies in this franchise that didn't use the original score or some form of it. Blows my mind. But regardless, in this movie, the score, I mean, of course. I also love in this movie how there's this big kind of emphasis in this movie on subtleties, but they do go all out with the death scenes for Tina and Glen. I love that. Clearly put a ton of focus into it and was one of those things where it was like, all right, we're going to try to go for something here. And those are scenes that you will never forget. Those are scenes that you're like, how did they pull this off? Gory, brutal, scary. Obviously the stuff where, with Tina's kill, they had to kind of spin the room. Tina's on one side of the room and it's like, the guy that she's with is like, holy shit, what is going on here? This is horrifying. And then of course, Glen's death, inspired by the blood scene in The Shining. But, they had blood like pouring out of the set. It got onto some of the electrical equipment. Things were all just going crazy, which is just something that happens when you try to pull off something that people have never seen before. And you got to tip your cap to that they went for it, and Glen's death, for me especially, Glen's death is just so memorable. Him getting sucked into the bed, all that blood. It's just, and then the cops and everybody else shows up and they're just like, this is crazy. What is going on this street? What's happening here? But I love that. And also kind of piggyback off of what I was talking about earlier with like the kids figuring things out and how much I love that. In this movie, of course, at the end, Nancy's, setting up the traps at the end of this movie, which just adds to that. I love that when you watch these young people who maybe are more mature beyond their years, like a Nancy is, figuring things out that even the adults can't figure out. Just shows you like, your kids are a lot smarter than sometimes you give them credit for. And sometimes we should probably listen a little bit, but love the traps at the end of the movie. I'm just a sucker for that trope, like young people setting up a trap to try to, trap the main villain in the story. I just love that. Anytime you see that in any movie, whether it's a werewolf movie, a vampire movie, or a movie like this, I love it. And then Nancy, of course, realizing what brings Freddy his life, right? He's fueled by the fear of his victims. And then she ultimately, of course, turns her back on Freddy, and says, this is just a dream. You're not alive. This whole thing is just a dream. And then we cut to the end, right? And it's bright. Nancy's outside. She's like, wait, what happened? And as an audience, you're also thinking like, whoa, this is turning me on my head real quick here. She's like, okay, wait, maybe it was just a nightmare. My friends are still alive. All right, life is good. Whew. Finally woke up from that. And then, nope. They came up with the ultimate decision to make the ending the way that they did. Bob Shea and Wes Craven did, argue and went back and forth about it, but ultimately came up with this ending, also to kind of leave it open for a sequel potentially, which Wes Craven didn't like, but ultimately he admits was the right decision. But of course, Nancy and her friends, they get in Glen's car, and then the roof comes over with Freddy's colors, and then it locks on them and they take off. We've got the girls jump roping, of course. And then it's one of those endings where I bet if you watch this movie in the theater, and I know the first time I watched this movie, which wasn't in the theater, of course, but it makes you leave and walk away from watching the movie thinking, damn, makes you kind of think your reality in a sense, like what's real and what's not. Obviously we have a lot of talk nowadays about simulation and virtual reality. And it's one of those inception moments of this movie where you're just like questioning your own reality in a way. And it's just brilliant. You know what I mean? It's just brilliant. Yeah. The original Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. What a great movie. What a masterpiece. What a classic. What a classic. Obviously kicked off this franchise that became larger than life, throughout the 80s especially. And, it's just one of those franchises that even if you're not into horror, who Freddy Krueger was. I remember my brother and I, we had never really been exposed to the Nightmare movies as a kid. Our parents were pretty strict about that kind of stuff, but we knew who Freddy was. We would wear the Freddy mask on Halloween, and just Freddy became such a pop culture icon in so many ways. But anyways, everybody, thanks for listening to my review of the original Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984. If you enjoy content like this, then make sure you subscribe, like this video as well if you enjoyed it. But I'll talk to you all in the next one.